So, Mao is like, as we're talking about People Republic of China under Mao. Mao himself can be at times very brutal leader, but he's certainly not that much of a corrupt leader. I mean, he wasn't doing this to get his own riches, but really believed in helping people, but often did it through the wrong way and probably was a little bit too idealistic about people's genuine desire to be socialist. So early on the regime, um, we see um, Mao certainly didn't tolerate dissent. So in the 1956, they made a request for critique, right? That's a kind of funny way, but communism, Marx always said, Karl Marx, who propagated communism, always said that the best way the system works is that you have got a regularly always be criticizing the system to see if it actually works. Now, of course, communist regimes tend to not allow free speech, so you don't have a lot of critiquing of the system. So here, when they open up to critique, the response for that was, yeah, anti-rightist again, politics of the right, anti-fascist, anti-rightist. A lot of people who were criticizing the government in China got thrown into jail, and purging about 100,000 people. They received um, were thrown in jail, uh, and others who were even killed. So that made people think twice about criticizing this regime for sure. The next step we want to talk about is kind of economic decisions or economic policy. China was engaged in 5 year plans, 5 year plan. In the first 5 year plan, they worked rather well, making China less agrarian and little bit of more industrialized, and providing some infrastructure, train system, road system, electricity. Again, communist type of regimes do well at this kind of transition because they can simply say, everybody, you got to do this, and it's not a matter trying to engage what the market wants. You just say, we want certain things in place, we will do everything to guide the society towards that. So central planning can work really well at that stage of development. But the next step after the first year program was something called the Great Leap Forward, which maybe was supposed to be another 5 year plan, but it didn't make it that far. What the idea was again to transfer power in economic decision making, but not political decision making. But the economic decision making uh, was transferred into local hands of largely the peasants, and this was a disaster. It led to very irrational policies. It was not very centralized, but rather decentralized. It was just this idea, yeah, you guys can make uh, make some steel, right? And so the peasants started making ovens, right? But they weren't linked to the actual productions or anything. So they were making raw steels from iron ore, but it wasn't linked with any product. And instead of focusing on what they have been doing before, mainly producing food and food production, many of the peasants kind of rather blindly charge into producing these things. So first, it wasn't productive, and um, but more disastrously, it led to underproduction of food, together with a bad winter and some drought, and this led to mass starvation. About 20-30 millions dead, and they died. And when we talk about now being a mass murderer, that is generally what we are talking about. Um, Obviously is responsible. I mean, we are referring to Mao, but it's not quite the same thing as saying I'm going to throw people in jail and purge them for these political views. It was inept economic policies that led to this. That really hurts the peasants um, and the worst. And food was still being trans-channeled to the big cities, but in the sense there were some in that sense there were some discrimination as to who was to starve and who wasn't. But overall it was harmful. In the face of this, Mao turned to his economic minister and what should we do. And this economic minister was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said, let's move towards the market a little bit more. And rather than the strong decentralized policy, let's follow the Soviet model and um, heavy top-down centralized control. And this did pull uh, the fat out of the fire. In the sense, it did rescue China. China moved back towards normal economic production, especially in agriculture. But Mao was very unhappy. You know. Here was that this attempt to empower the peasants economically, and it hadn't worked, and also led a lot of people to question socialism. Um, and he felt, it hadn't worked, and he felt that people are moving towards away from socialism. So the next thing is time for new plan, and this was called culture. This was known as Cultural Revolution, which basically lasted for about a decade. This has nothing to do with Chinese culture. Let's be clear on that. It has to do with creating socialist culture. Um, this has to do with trying to push people towards becoming better socialists, identifying the socialism. Now, the problem with this is that this largely, but put the political control into the hands of party activists. Maybe with the people who didn't know what they were doing, but people who could recite Marx and Chairman Mao's little book backward and forward, and he simply wanted Western views, right to be exercised, and right to capitalism out, and Western views out, jazz music out. So, focusing on good Chinese and socialist value, uh, this led to a lot of generational problem, mm, where some of the older generation had grew up before communism, and the young people had been really brainwashed into nothing but communism. And like parents were working in the field in the backyard and selling things in black market. You sometimes saw younger generations reporting on their parents and elders and getting them thrown to jail and demoted or sent to educational camps. So it was creating a situation um, uh, verging on civil war. It really came to end when Mao died in 1975. His wife and certain um, um, party people tried to uh, get the control, but in the end, the person who came into control is Deng Xiaoping once again, who has been sent out to pastures during the Cultural Revolution, his liking to capitalism was seen as problematic. So he was again removed from his post out of politics. But when they came his transition after the death of Mao, the Communist Party decided to turn to Deng Xiaoping. So then Deng Xiaoping's big move was that he would call economic liberalization, uh, means opening up to liberalizing, uh, to free and he said, okay, China, if it's going to move forward, needs to introduce more economic market-led policies. This would be little bit of political. There would be little bit of political loosening, but what we are talking about is um, economic loosening. Starting to um, listen to the market, uh, starting to listen to producers a little bit more, not just to centralized the state leads economic development when creating consumer goods, um, meaning the individual company enterprises start to figure out what China wants and what rest of the world wants, and let's start trading. And this led to opening of China, at least economically, and calls for it to develop um, more democratic as well. Um, the moment there would be the political loosening, the economic loosening also prompted people for the political loosening, and the movement that there would be a 1989 Tiananmen Square, where protesters, largely students, along with other protesters, gathered on the square um, until June 4th, when the army responded with the tanks rolled in and some people killed, and everybody that was part of the movement per, pursued, and they started to chase one another, and led to a period of repression against the leader of this movement. And again, it was a major message from leaders uh, that economic liberalization is fine, but political reforms was not going to happen at this time. So, no to democracy, despite what Axelrod might have wished us to think. The political relaxation moves towards solving rural poverty that has occurred in the last 20 years ago, occurred under the leaders who are, we say, technocrats leaders. Uh, so they let economists make most of the decision and they try to keep firm and politically. That would be Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and the current president Xi Jinping, who is current premier, which just simply means that they are not only president but also head of Politburo. I mean, it's a kind of inner circle within the Communist Party that runs everything. So it's a product of top-down policy, and any kind of local attempts to create greater democracy has not worked. Local attempts to create greater and capitalism have certainly worked, but right now we are focusing more on the political side of things, and we have to say China is still tightly authoritarian. At this time, maybe not quite to the degree of totalitarianism, but it's certainly authoritarianism. That being said, now let's move on to this other piece for this week, which we have to, for the reading, is by Wedge, which talks about public sphere in China. So let's move on to discussing that article now.